the throne looms above. The hall is silent. In the medieval world, justice did not always come from courts or councils, it came from the king. His word was law, his judgment final. With a glance, he could grant mercy. With a whisper, he could condemn a man to death. To stand before the crown was to gamble with your very life. If history's shadows call to you, leave a like to keep the fire burning, and subscribe to Nighttime Historians so you never miss the dark truths that shaped our world. Tonight, we descend into the age of medieval justice, when kings decided life and death. The torch gutters in the stone chamber, casting dancing shadows against walls that have witnessed 1,000 confessions. A man kneels upon the cold flagstones, his wrists bound behind him with rope that has already begun to chafe flesh raw. Above him, seated upon a chair carved from oak and iron, a figure draped in ermine and authority holds the power of life and death in his jeweled hands. The year is 1387. The place is the Tower of London. The crime is treason. And in this moment, suspended between heartbeat and heartbeat, between breath and breath, the very essence of medieval justice hangs like smoke in the air. Absolute, unquestioning, divine. Speak your name. Comes the voice from the throne, cold as winterstone. The kneeling man's lips move, but no sound emerges. Fear has stolen his voice, as it has stolen the voices of countless others who have knelt in this very spot. The chamber breathes with the weight of centuries, each stone a silent witness to the terrible machinery of royal justice. Here, beneath these vaulted ceilings, mercy and vengeance dance their eternal dance, partners bound by threads of divine right and mortal terror. This is not merely the story of one man's judgment. This is the chronicle of an age when justice wore a crown, when law flowed from the lips of kings like holy water from a blessed chalice, when the divine right of rulers cast its shadow across every courthouse, every scaffold, every trembling soul who dared to challenge the natural order of God and crown. In the medieval world, justice was not blind, it saw everything through the eyes of sovereignty, and those eyes burned with the fire of absolute authority. The prisoner raises his head at last, and in his eyes flickers something more dangerous than fear, defiance. It is a look that has toppled kingdoms and raised the dead. It is the look that transforms subjects into rebels, that turns whispered doubts into roaring revolution. But here, in this stone-wrapped silence, defiance is merely another crime to be judged, another sin to be weighed upon the scales of royal justice. The king, for it is indeed a king who sits in judgment, Richard II of England, young and terrible in his authority, leans forward. His crown catches the torchlight, sending fragments of gold dancing across the prisoner's upturned face. Thomas of Woodstock. The king speaks, and the name falls like a stone into still water, sending ripples through the darkness. Duke of Gloucester. Uncle to the crown. And traitor to the realm. The word traitor echoes in the chamber like a bell tolling for the dead. In the medieval mind, treason is not merely a crime, it is a fundamental violation of the cosmic order, a tear in the fabric that binds earth to heaven, subject to sovereign, mortal to divine. To stand accused of treason in this age is to stand accused of challenging God himself, for kings rule not by consent but by celestial appointment, their authority flowing down from the throne of the Almighty like light from the sun. Thomas of Woodstock does not flinch at the accusation. Perhaps he cannot. Perhaps fear has frozen him as surely as winter freezes the Thames. Or perhaps, in this moment between accusation and judgment, he has found something harder and more precious than courage, the terrible clarity that comes when a man realizes he stands at the very edge of the world. You have conspired against our person, the king continues, his voice gaining strength with each word. You have raised arms against your anointed sovereign. You have forgotten the bonds of blood and the sacred duty of the loyal subject. Each accusation falls like a blow, methodical and crushing. This is not merely a trial. It is a ritual, a ceremony of judgment that reaches back through the centuries to the very foundations of royal power. In the shadows beyond the torchlight, scribes bend over parchment, their quills scratching across the surface like tiny claws. They record not merely words but the essence of an age when justice was personal, when law was will, when the difference between righteousness and tyranny lay not in statute or precedent but in the character of the man who wore the crown. Their ink will outlive both king and prisoner, carrying forward into future centuries the terrible intimacy of medieval justice. The prisoner's breathing grows shallow, each inhalation a victory over fear, each exhalation a small surrender to fate. Around him, the stone walls seem to lean inward, as if the very architecture of power seeks to crush dissent. This is the weight of royal justice, not merely the threat of death, but the certainty that death, when it comes, will be sanctioned by heaven itself. What say you to these charges? The king's question hangs in the air like incense, sweet and suffocating. In any other age, in any other place, this might be the moment for defense, for explanation, for the measured presentation of evidence and law. But this is not any other age. This is the medieval world, where justice flows from the crown like water from a spring, pure and unquestioned in its source. Thomas of Woodstock raises his eyes to meet his nephew's gaze, and in that meeting of eyes, royal and condemned, young and old, absolute power and absolute powerlessness, the entire architecture of medieval justice stands revealed. There is no jury of peers here, no learned judges weighing statute and precedent. There is only the will of the sovereign, terrible in its simplicity, divine in its authority. I am guilty, the prisoner whispers, of believing that even kings must answer to something higher than their own desires. The words fall into silence like stones into a deep well. In this chamber, surrounded by the instruments of royal power, such words are not merely treasonous. They are impossible, unthinkable, a violation of the natural order as profound as the sun rising in the west. Yet they have been spoken, and in their speaking, they illuminate the terrible paradox at the heart of medieval justice, the absolute authority of the crown resting upon the absolute submission of the subject. The king's face hardens like cooling metal. In his youth lies not mercy but something far more dangerous, the terrible certainty of divine appointment. He has been raised to believe that his will and God's will are one and the same, that his judgment carries the weight of celestial authority. To challenge him is not merely to commit a crime, it is to challenge the very order of creation. Then you shall have the justice you have earned. Richard speaks, and his words carry the finality of thunder. Take him! Guards emerge from the shadows like phantoms, their armor catching fragments of torchlight. They move with practiced efficiency, lifting the prisoner to his feet, beginning the ritual procession that will carry him from this chamber of judgment to whatever fate awaits. But before they can take their first step toward the door, Thomas of Woodstock speaks once more. Remember, nephew, he says, his voice carrying a strength that seems impossible in a condemned man, that the crown you wear was placed there by the same God who will one day call you to account for how you have used it. The words hang in the chamber like a curse, or perhaps like a prayer. The guards pause, uncertain whether such words constitute a final act of treason or something else entirely, a reminder that even divine right must answer to divine judgment. The king's face remains stone, but something flickers in his eyes, quick as lightning, gone as soon as glimpsed. Then the moment passes, and the procession begins. Footsteps echo against stone as the prisoner is led away, each step a drumbeat marking the terrible rhythm of medieval justice. The torchlight wavers, casting the king's shadow large against the wall, a shadow that seems to stretch not merely across the chamber but across the entire age, touching every subject, every court, every soul who lives beneath the absolute authority of the crown. As the footsteps fade and silence returns to the chamber, the king remains upon his throne, motionless as carved stone. In the dancing torchlight, his crown seems less a symbol of authority than a burden, heavy with the weight of decisions that brook no appeal, judgments that admit no error. This is the price of absolute power, not merely the right to decide life and death, but the terrible isolation that comes with such authority. The scribes continue their work, recording for posterity the judgment that has just unfolded. Their quills scratch against parchment like the sound of time itself, marking the passage of moments that will echo through the centuries. They write of treason and justice, of royal authority and divine right, but they cannot capture the human cost of absolute power, the weight that settles upon the soul of a man who must be both judge and executioner, both servant of God and master of men. Outside the chamber, London sleeps fitfully under a canopy of stars. In the taverns and alehouses, men speak in whispers of the Duke's arrest, of the King's growing tyranny, of the dangerous currents that swirl beneath the surface of royal authority. They sense, perhaps without fully understanding, that they are witnessing something more than a simple matter of justice. They are witnessing the terrible dynamics of power itself, the eternal struggle between authority and freedom that lies at the heart of all human governance. But inside the chamber, there is only silence and the guttering torch. The king sits alone with his thoughts, alone with his power, alone with the terrible knowledge that tomorrow will bring new decisions, new judgments, new moments when the fate of human souls will hang upon his words. This is the burden of medieval justice, not merely the power to command, but the isolation that comes with command, the terrible loneliness of absolute authority. The torch burns lower, its flame dancing like a soul in torment. Soon it will gutter out entirely, leaving the chamber in darkness. But the darkness will not touch the crown, it will gleam in shadow as it gleams in light, eternal symbol of an authority that claims to flow from heaven itself. And in that gleam lies both the promise and the threat of medieval justice, the promise of order, of hierarchy, of a world where every man knows his place, and the threat of tyranny, of arbitrary power, of a world where the difference between right and wrong rests solely in the will of the sovereign. The flame wavers, burns lower, and dies. But the crown remains, invisible in the darkness yet more present than ever, a reminder that in the medieval world, justice never sleeps, never rests, never questions its own authority. It simply is, as inevitable as sunrise, as inescapable as death itself. Dawn breaks over London like a blade drawn across the throat of night, and with it comes the sound that has summoned subjects to judgment for 1,000 years, the tolling of the great bell at Westminster. Each bronze note rolls across the city like thunder, calling the people to witness what few dare to question, the manifestation of royal justice in all its terrible majesty. The scaffold stands in the pale morning light like a crude altar, its timbers fresh cut and still weeping sap. Around it, the crowd gathers with the grim fascination that draws men to watch their fellows die, part horror, part relief that today the axe falls upon another neck. They come wrapped in wool and rough-spun cloth, their faces gaunt with the lean hunger that is the common lot of common men. They smell of smoke and sweat and the peculiar sourness that clings to those who live always at the edge of want. But among them move figures of a different sort, men whose fine cloth and soft hands speak of wealth, whose careful neutral expressions reveal minds busy with calculation. These are the merchants and minor nobles, the courtiers and clerics who must appear at such spectacles not from curiosity but from necessity. To absent oneself from a royal execution is to risk the terrible attention of a king who sees rebellion in every empty space, treason in every turn back. The condemned man stands upon the scaffold like a figure carved from shadow and resolve. Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, uncle to kings, brother to the Black Prince, descendant of the Plantagenet line that has ruled England for 2 centuries. His hands are bound behind him with rope, but his spine remains straight as a blade. The common folk below crane their necks to see him, this man who has walked with royalty and now walks to death, and in their eyes burns something more complex than simple bloodlust. They see themselves reflected in his fate, their own powerlessness magnified and made manifest. "Behold the fruits of treason!" cries the herald, his voice carrying across the crowd like the call of some great bird. "Let all who would challenge the sacred authority of our sovereign lord the king look upon this sight and learn wisdom." The words echo off the surrounding buildings, the shops and houses that lean into the square like curious watchers, their windows filled with pale faces that peer down from what they imagine is safety. But there is no safety in the medieval world for those who live beneath the crown's shadow. Today it is a duke who dies. Tomorrow it might be a merchant who spoke too freely in his cups, a priest who preached too boldly from his pulpit, a common man who forgot to remove his cap when the royal standard passed. The executioner stands beside his block like some primeval figure from mankind's darkest dreams. His face is hidden beneath a leather mask, but his hands, those terrible, skilled hands, are bare. They have learned their craft through repetition, through the kind of practice that comes only when kings rule by fear and subjects die for their disobedience. The axe he carries was forged in the workshops of the tower, its steel blessed by priests and sharpened by men who understand that in the medieval world, death must be both swift and certain. "Have you any final words?" the herald asks, but his question carries no real expectation of answer. In the machinery of royal justice, the condemned are expected to confess their guilt, beg the king's forgiveness, and warn others against following their path to destruction. These are the proper rituals, the expected ceremonies that transform judicial murder into righteous punishment. But Thomas of Woodstock was not raised to mouth expected words. Born to power, bred to command, he has spent his life in the presence of kings and knows better than most the terrible weight of the crown's authority. When he speaks, his words carry across the square with a clarity that seems impossible for a man about to die. "I have served 3 kings of England," he says, his voice reaching even to the farthest edges of the crowd. "I have fought in their wars, defended their realm, and shed my blood in their service. If this be treason, then loyalty itself has become a crime." A murmur runs through the crowd like wind through wheat. These are dangerous words, not because they challenge the king's judgment, but because they reveal the terrible arbitrariness that lies at the heart of royal authority. In a world where law and royal will are one and the same, any subject might wake to find himself branded traitor, any act of service reinterpreted as rebellion. The herald raises his hand for silence, but the murmur continues, a sound like distant thunder that speaks of minds awakening, of subjects beginning to question what they have always accepted without thought. This is the moment that kings fear most, not rebellion, but the first stirring of doubt in minds accustomed to obedience. "The crimes of Thomas of Woodstock," the herald proclaims, his voice struggling to overmaster the crowd's unrest, "are known to God and King. He has conspired against the royal person, sought to limit the sacred authority of the crown, and placed his own judgment above that of his anointed sovereign. These are not the actions of a loyal subject but of a traitor to king and realm." Yet even as the herald speaks, the crowd's attention remains fixed upon the condemned man himself. There is something in his bearing, a dignity that refuses to be broken, a courage that transforms the scaffold from a place of shame into something resembling honor, that speaks to depths in the human soul that authority cannot touch. The common folk see in him not merely a duke brought low, but a reflection of their own powerlessness made noble by its refusal to yield. The king himself watches from a window high above the square, his face a mask that conceals whatever thoughts move behind his royal eyes. From this height, the crowd appears as a single creature, dark and restless, possessed of moods that shift like weather. He has learned to read these moods, to sense the difference between the bloodthirst that cheers a popular execution and the sullen resentment that marks the death of a sympathetic figure. Today, he sees something that troubles him, the crowd's reluctance to cheer, their uncomfortable silence in the face of ducal dignity. A popular king might have called for mercy, transformed justice into magnanimity, won the love of subjects by sparing a condemned uncle. But Richard II has never been a popular king. His authority rests not on love but on fear, not on the willing obedience of grateful subjects, but on the terrible certainty that disobedience brings death. "Let the sentence be carried out," he murmurs to the courtier who stands beside him, and his words carry the weight of absolute authority. Below, the herald raises his staff, the signal that transforms words into action, ceremony into finality. The crowd falls silent as Thomas of Woodstock kneels beside the block. The executioner raises his axe, the steel blade catching the morning light like a fragment of the sun itself. In this moment, suspended between life and death, between one heartbeat and the next, the entire apparatus of medieval justice stands revealed in all its terrible simplicity, the absolute power of the crown made manifest through the ultimate sanction of death. The axe falls with a sound like thunder, and with it falls something more than a single life. In the crowd below, men and women who have never questioned the divine right of kings feel something shift in their souls, a small crack in the foundation of unthinking obedience that will widen with time until it splits the very bedrock of royal authority. Blood darkens the scaffold timbers, but it is not only the Duke's blood that is spilled here. It is the blood of certainty, of unquestioned faith in royal justice, of the ancient compact between crown and subject that has held England together since the conquest. The king above may have won his victory over a rebellious uncle, but he has lost something far more precious: the willing submission of hearts that can no longer distinguish between justice and vengeance. The crowd begins to disperse, but their movement is different now, less like subjects returning to their proper stations than like men and women carrying away questions that will not easily be answered. They have witnessed the ultimate expression of royal power, and in witnessing it, they have begun to understand both its terrible strength and its inherent weakness. The executioner cleans his blade with a cloth that will be burned before sunset, as if fire could cleanse the steel of more than blood. The scaffold will stand for 3 days as prescribed by custom, a reminder to all who pass of the price of challenging royal authority. But reminders work both ways. They can inspire fear, but they can also kindle anger, and anger, once kindled in the heart of a people, burns with a fire that crowns cannot easily extinguish. In the royal chamber above, the king turns from the window, but the sight below lingers in his mind like an unwelcome guest. He has demonstrated his power, asserted his authority, shown all England that none stand beyond the reach of royal justice. Yet in the demonstration, he has revealed something else as well: the terrible isolation of absolute power, the loneliness of a man who must rule through fear because he cannot rule through love. The courtiers around him murmur words of congratulation, speak of justice done and authority maintained. But their words sound hollow in the morning air, like prayers offered to a God who no longer listens. They know, as the king knows, as the crowd below knows, that something has changed in this moment, something fundamental in the relationship between ruler and ruled that cannot be unchanged by all the royal proclamations in Christendom. Justice has been done according to the laws and customs of the medieval world. A traitor has paid the ultimate price for his rebellion against lawful authority. The crown's majesty has been upheld, its power demonstrated, its divine sanction confirmed by the shedding of noble blood. Yet in the very completeness of this victory lies the seed of something that will, in time, grow into defeat. For the crowd that disperses from the scaffold square carries with it a memory that will not fade, the sight of a man who died with dignity intact, who faced the ultimate power of the medieval world and refused to be broken by it. In years to come, when other men face other scaffolds, they will remember Thomas of Woodstock, and in remembering him, they will find the courage to die well, or perhaps, more dangerously still, the courage to live in defiance of unjust authority. The sun climbs higher, burning away the morning mist that has shrouded London like a funeral shroud. But no sun can burn away the memory of what has transpired here. No royal proclamation can unsay the words that have been spoken. No assertion of divine right can restore the innocence of unquestioned obedience. The medieval world continues as it has for centuries, ruled by kings who claim divine appointment, and enforced by justice that flows from the crown like water from a poisoned well. Yet beneath the surface of this ancient order, something new stirs, a question that will not be silenced, a doubt that will not be crushed, a recognition that power, however absolute, however sanctified by custom and blessed by priests, remains in the end a human creation, subject to human judgment and vulnerable to human resistance. The scaffold stands empty now, but its shadow stretches far beyond the square where it was erected. That shadow will fall across the courts and castles of England, across the halls where kings hold council and the chambers where subjects plot rebellion. It will remind all who see it that medieval justice, for all its terrible majesty, rests ultimately upon the consent of the governed, and that consent, once withdrawn, can never be fully restored. In the great hall of Westminster Palace, where the very stones seem to breathe with centuries of accumulated power, King Richard sits alone before the dying embers of a fire that has burned since before the conquest. The flames cast shifting shadows across tapestries that tell the story of royal triumph: William the Conqueror at Hastings, Henry Plantagenet receiving homage, Edward Longshanks hammering the Scots. But tonight, these victories seem like ghosts, pale memories of an authority that once seemed as solid as the tower's stones and now feels as fragile as morning frost. The king's hands rest upon the carved arms of his throne, but they tremble with something that is not cold. In his mind, he replays the morning's execution, searching for the satisfaction that should come with justice well served, with royal authority properly maintained. Instead, he finds only the echo of his uncle's final words, circling in his thoughts like carrion birds around a battlefield. That the crown you wear was placed there by the same God who will one day call you to account. The words refuse to be dismissed, refuse to fade into the comfortable darkness where uncomfortable truths go to die. They hang in the air of the great hall like incense, sweet and suffocating, carrying with them implications that no king wishes to contemplate. For if the crown is indeed a gift from God, then its use must be subject to divine judgment, and divine judgment, unlike human justice, admits no appeal, no bribery, no political calculation. A knock at the great doors interrupts his brooding, followed by the measured footsteps of Sir John Bushy, one of the king's most trusted counselors. Bushy approaches the throne with the careful step of a man who has learned to read royal moods as shepherds read the sky, watching for storms that can destroy the unwary. "Your Grace," Bushy says, bowing low enough to demonstrate submission without appearing to grovel. "The execution has been carried out according to your commands. The Duke of Gloucester is dead." Richard does not immediately respond. The word dead seems to echo in the vast hall, multiplying and growing until it fills every corner with its finality. Dead, the most absolute word in any language, the word that transforms princes into carrion, that reduces all human ambition to silence. "And the people?" the king asks at last, his voice carefully neutral. "How did they receive this demonstration of royal justice?" Bushy hesitates, and in that hesitation lies a world of careful calculation. He is walking the razor's edge that every courtier knows, the narrow path between truth and flattery, between honest counsel and dangerous candor. To lie to the king is treason, but to tell unwelcome truths can be equally fatal. "They were subdued, Your Grace," Bushy finally says, choosing his words like a man picking his way through a minefield. "The Duke died well, with dignity befitting his station. The crowd respected his courage, though they did not question the justice of your sentence." It is a diplomat's answer, crafted to convey information while avoiding uncomfortable implications. But Richard has learned to read between the lines of courtly language, to hear the truths that dare not speak their names directly. "Subdued," he repeats, and the word tastes bitter on his tongue. "Not cheering, then? Not celebrating the removal of a traitor from their midst?" "The common people are not given to deep thought about matters of state, Your Grace," Bushy ventures. "They see only what lies before their eyes, a duke who served the realm faithfully for many years, brought low by circumstances they do not fully understand." Circumstances. Richard's voice carries a note of something dangerous, the particular anger of a king who senses that his actions are being questioned, however subtly. "Is that what you call treason against the crown? Circumstances?" Bushy drops to one knee, recognizing that he has ventured too near the cliff's edge. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I spoke poorly. The Duke's crimes were clear and his punishment just. I meant only that the common folk, in their ignorance, may not fully comprehend the necessity of what was done." The king waves a hand, dismissing both the apology and the man who offers it. Bushy rises and backs away from the throne, his relief at escaping royal displeasure evident in every line of his retreating figure. When he is gone, Richard returns to his contemplation of the dying fire, but now his thoughts have taken a darker turn. The common folk, in their ignorance, may not fully comprehend the necessity of what was done. The words circle in his mind like hunters around wounded prey. But what if their ignorance is not the problem? What if, in their simplicity, they see something that the wise and learned have chosen to ignore, the difference between justice and revenge, between royal authority and royal tyranny? The fire collapses upon itself with a shower of sparks, each tiny ember dying as it touches the cold stone of the hearth. The metaphor is too obvious, too perfect, the dying of the light, the inevitable darkness that awaits all earthly power. Richard shivers, though the hall is not cold, and pulls his royal robes more tightly around himself. From somewhere in the palace comes the sound of music, a lute played softly in some distant chamber, its melody both sweet and melancholy. The notes drift through the corridors like lost souls, carrying with them memories of happier times when the crown sat more lightly upon royal shoulders, when subjects loved their king because they chose to, not because they feared the alternative. Those days seem as distant now as the age of Arthur, as mythical as the golden age that poets sing about but historians know never existed. Richard remembers his grandfather, Edward III, who ruled for 50 years and died beloved of his people. Edward had been a warrior king, a conqueror whose victories in France had filled English hearts with pride and English coffers with gold. But Richard is not Edward, and these are not times for conquest and glory. These are darker times, times when the crown's authority must be maintained not through foreign victories but through domestic terror, not through the inspiration of leadership but through the application of fear. It is a bitter inheritance, this necessity of ruling through violence, but it is the inheritance that history has bequeathed to him. A servant enters quietly, carrying fresh logs for the fire. He works in silence, building the flames back to life with the practiced efficiency of one who has served in royal households for years. The new fire catches quickly, sending fresh light dancing across the walls, but somehow the illumination seems weaker than before, as if the very air has grown thicker, more resistant to dispelling darkness. "Tell me," the king says suddenly, his voice causing the servant to freeze mid-motion. "What do the people say of today's work?" The servant's face goes pale, recognizing the terrible danger of the question. To speak truly might bring death, but to lie to a king is treason. For a long moment he remains motionless, caught between equally fatal alternatives. "Speak freely," Richard commands, though his tone suggests that freedom of speech may be a luxury this servant cannot afford. "I would know what is said in the taverns and markets, what whispers pass between goodwife and goodman when they think no royal ears can hear." The servant swallows hard, then speaks in a voice barely above a whisper. They say the Duke was a good man, your grace. That he served the realm faithfully. They wonder why such service should end in death." "And what do you think?" the king asks, leaning forward in his throne like a predator scenting prey. "Do you think the Duke deserved his fate?" It is the question that no subject should ever be asked, the question that admits no safe answer. To say yes is to participate in what many believe to be judicial murder. To say no is to challenge the king's judgment directly. The servant remains silent, perhaps hoping that silence itself might be interpreted as an answer. "I see," Richard says at last, his voice heavy with a meaning that the servant can only guess at. "Your silence speaks as loudly as words. You may go." The servant flees with the desperate haste of a man who has looked into the abyss and seen it looking back. When he is gone, the king returns to his solitary brooding, but now his thoughts have crystallized around a single, terrible recognition: he is losing his people. Not through rebellion, not through foreign invasion, but through something far more subtle and far more dangerous: the quiet withdrawal of affection, the slow erosion of legitimacy that comes when subjects can no longer distinguish between a king and a tyrant. The realization brings with it a curious sense of liberation. If he cannot be loved, then he need not try to earn love. If he cannot inspire loyalty through kindness, then he must enforce it through fear. It is a harsh mathematics, the dark arithmetic of power, but it has its own terrible logic. Better to be feared than ignored. Better to rule through terror than to lose rule entirely. Better to be remembered as a tyrant than forgotten as a weakling. These are the choices that history offers to kings who inherit troubled times, and Richard makes his choice with the grim determination of a man who sees clearly into the abyss and chooses to become its master rather than its victim. From his robes he draws forth a small silver bell, its voice clear and sweet in the vast hall. The sound brings guards running, men whose loyalty is purchased with gold and maintained through fear, but loyalty nonetheless. They kneel before the throne, awaiting their king's commands with the disciplined patience of professional soldiers. "Send word to the sheriffs of all counties," Richard commands, his voice carrying a new note of cold determination. "Let it be known that the king's justice reaches into every corner of the realm. Any man who speaks treason, any woman who questions royal authority, any child who fails to show proper respect for the crown, all shall face the consequences of their defiance." The guards exchange glances, recognizing the implications of such an order. To enforce it properly would require a network of spies and informants. a system of surveillance that would transform every English village into a prison, every English subject into either a guard or a prisoner. "It shall be done, Your Grace," their captain says, though his voice carries little enthusiasm for the task. He has served this king faithfully, has carried out commands that would have made his grandfather sick with horror, but even professional soldiers have their limits. "See that it is," Richard replies, settling back in his throne with something approaching satisfaction. "And let word spread that the king's mercy has limits, but his justice has none. Those who challenge the crown will learn that royal authority, once provoked, is as implacable as the tide and as final as the grave." The guards withdraw to carry out their orders, but their departure leaves the great hall feeling somehow emptier than before, as if the very stones have recognized that something fundamental has changed in the nature of royal power. The fire burns brightly, casting dancing shadows that seem to writhe with a life of their own, but the warmth it provides feels insufficient against the growing chill that has settled over the throne of England. Outside, London sleeps fitfully under a starless sky, its citizens dreaming uneasy dreams of scaffolds and axes, of royal justice and arbitrary power. In taverns and workshops, in great houses and humble cottages, the events of the morning are discussed in whispers that grow quieter with each telling, as if the very act of speaking might bring royal attention down upon the speaker's head. But whispers have a way of multiplying in the darkness, of spreading like ripples from a stone cast into still water. And in those whispers, in those quiet conversations between subject and subject, something new is being born. Not yet rebellion, not yet revolution, but something that might, in time, grow into either or both. The king sits alone before his fire, master of all he surveys, absolute ruler of a realm that stretches from the Scottish borders to the English Channel. His power is complete, his authority unquestioned, his will law throughout the land. Yet in his solitude, surrounded by the trappings of majesty, he feels something that no amount of power can dispel, the cold breath of mortality, the whisper of doubt, the growing certainty that the crown he wears, however divine its origin, rests upon the head of a man who bleeds as other men bleed, who dies as other men die, who will face judgment as other men face judgment. The fire burns lower, its flames dancing their ancient dance of light and shadow. But darkness gathers at the edges of the great hall, patient and inexorable as time itself. And in that darkness, the future stirs like a creature awakening from long slumber, hungry and terrible and utterly without mercy for kings who have forgotten that power without justice is tyranny, and tyranny, however absolute, however sanctified, carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction. Dawn comes reluctantly to the scriptorium of Westminster Abbey, filtered through narrow windows that cast pale rectangles of light across stone floors worn smooth by centuries of shuffling sandals. Here, in this sacred space where vellum whispers secrets to goosequill pens, Brother Aldrich bends over his lectern like a man at prayer. His fingers, stained black with ink and brown with age, trace careful letters across the parchment, letters that will outlive kings and kingdoms, that will carry the weight of judgment into ages yet unborn. The chronicle he writes bears no name, for in these dangerous times, even the dead may have living enemies. But the words themselves burn with a fire that no royal proclamation can extinguish. In the year of our Lord 1387, on the feast of St. Michael, Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, was brought to the block for the crime of speaking truth to power. His death marks not the triumph of justice, but its corruption, the moment when law becomes the servant of will, and the crown's authority transforms from divine mandate into mortal tyranny. Brother Aldrich pauses, his pen suspended above the parchment like a sword above a neck. These are dangerous words, treasonous words, the kind of words that have sent better men than he to share the Duke's fate. Yet they demand to be written, burn in his mind like fever until ink gives them form and permanence transforms them from thought into testimony. The scriptorium around him breathes with the accumulated silence of centuries. Here, monks have copied the sacred texts, preserved the wisdom of ages, maintained the fragile thread that connects the present to the eternal. But today, Brother Aldrich writes not of saints and miracles, not of divine love and redemption, but of the terrible machinery of earthly power, of kings who claim God's authority while serving their own passions. A shadow falls across his parchment, and he looks up to see Brother Francis standing beside his lectern. Francis is young, barely 20 years in the world, his face still smooth with innocence despite his years in the monastery. But his eyes hold a troubled light, the look of a man who has seen something that challenges everything he thought he knew about the order of creation. "Brother Aldrich," Francis whispers, his voice barely audible in the sacred silence. "I was at the execution yesterday. I saw the Duke die." Aldrich sets down his pen, recognizing in the young monk's face the same struggle that wars in his own heart. The conflict between duty and conscience, between the order that demands silence and the truth that demands voice. "And what did you see, brother?" Aldrich asks, though he already knows the answer. It is written in the lines around Francis's eyes, in the way his hands shake as he speaks. "I saw a good man die for the crime of being too honest," Francis says, his voice gaining strength with each word. "I saw royal justice reveal itself as royal vengeance. I saw the crown's divine authority exposed as mortal tyranny dressed in ermine and gold." The words hang between them like a challenge, like a confession, like a prayer offered to a God who may or may not be listening. Around them, the other monks continue their work, copying psalms, illuminating manuscripts, performing the endless labor that preserves civilization from the darkness that always threatens to overwhelm it. But their work seems somehow diminished now, less important than this moment of truth-telling between two men who have seen behind the veil of earthly power. "Such words could cost us both our lives," Aldrich observes, but his tone carries no rebuke, only the weary acknowledgement of a man who has already made his choice. "Then let them," Francis replies with the passionate certainty of youth. "Better to die for truth than to live for lies. Better to face the king's justice than to face God's judgment knowing we chose silence when we should have spoken." Aldrich smiles, an expression both sad and proud. In this young monk he sees something precious, the courage that authority cannot crush, the integrity that power cannot purchase, the stubborn human insistence that right and wrong exist independently of royal will. "Then help me," Aldrich says, returning to his parchment. "Help me write what must be written, preserve what must be preserved, testify to what we have witnessed." Francis moves closer to the lectern, watching as Aldrich's pen resumes its careful dance across the vellum. The letters that emerge are more than words. They are weapons, tools of resistance more dangerous than any sword, more threatening to royal power than any army. "In this same year," Aldrich writes while Francis watches, "the young King Richard, second of that name, did demonstrate that divine right may be claimed by mortal men, but divine justice remains with God alone. For though he wore the crown of England and commanded the obedience of all subjects, he could not command the conscience of those who serve a higher authority than any earthly throne." The work continues in whispered collaboration, two monks united in the dangerous task of preserving truth in an age when truth itself has become treason. They write of the execution they witnessed, but also of the larger pattern it represents, the slow corruption of royal authority, the transformation of justice into vengeance, the growing distance between the king and the people he claims to serve. "We must be careful," Aldrich murmurs as his pen scratches across the parchment. "These words will be read by eyes we cannot imagine, in times we will not see. They must speak not just to our age but to all ages, not just to England but to all lands where men claim divine authority to rule their fellows." "What will you call it?" Francis asks, watching the chronicle take shape beneath Aldrich's skilled hand. "The Chronicle of Royal Justice," Aldrich replies without hesitation. "For that is what it is, not a celebration of royal power, but an examination of how power corrupts, how authority becomes tyranny, how the gap between divine mandate and human implementation grows until it swallows kingdoms whole." The morning advances, bringing with it the sounds of the abbey's daily routine, bells calling monks to prayer, sandals whispering across stone floors, the distant chanting of the office that has continued unbroken since the abbey's founding. But in the scriptorium, time seems suspended, held in check by the weight of what is being created. "Tell me about the crowd," Aldrich says suddenly, his pen pausing in its work. "Tell me what you saw in their faces, heard in their voices. The official chronicles will speak only of justice served and royal authority maintained. But you were there. You saw the truth. Francis closes his eyes, as if looking back through time to that terrible morning in the scaffold square. They were afraid, he says slowly. Not of the Duke, of the King. They had come expecting to see a traitor die, but instead they saw a good man murdered. And in seeing it, they began to understand something they had never understood before. What? Aldrich prompts gently. That if the king could kill his own uncle for speaking truth, he could kill anyone. That royal justice, once corrupted, recognizes no limits, respects no bonds, spares no one. Francis opens his eyes, and in them burns a light that is both terrible and beautiful. They left that square different than they entered it. They left as subjects who had begun to question their subjection. Aldrich nods, understanding perfectly. This is why the chronicle must be written, why the truth must be preserved. Not for the comfort of those who witness injustice, but for the guidance of those who will inherit its consequences. And the king? Aldrich asks. Did you see the king? I saw his shadow, Francis replies. He watched from a window high above the square, hidden like a coward behind stone and glass. But even from that distance, I could feel his presence, cold as winter wind, hard as iron, empty as a tomb. The description sends a shiver through Aldrich, but he captures it in ink, adding it to the growing record of that day's events. Each detail matters, each observation carries weight, for this chronicle will serve as evidence in a court higher than any earthly tribunal, the court of history itself, where kings and subjects alike must answer for their choices. As the morning progresses toward noon, other monks begin to gather around Aldrich's lectern, drawn by some instinct that tells them they are witnessing something significant. They come quietly, respectfully, but their presence transforms the individual act of writing into something communal, something that speaks not just for two monks but for all who serve truth above authority. Brother Thomas, the abbey's treasurer, peers over Aldrich's shoulder at the growing chronicle. His face is grave, marked by the kind of worry that comes to men who must navigate between earthly and heavenly masters. This is dangerous work, brother, he observes, his voice heavy with concern. The king has eyes and ears everywhere. Word of such writing could bring royal displeasure down upon the entire abbey. Then let it, says Brother Francis with the fierce certainty of youth. Better to face royal displeasure than divine judgment. Better to suffer earthly punishment than eternal condemnation. But Brother Thomas shakes his head, his expression reflecting the painful wisdom that comes with age and responsibility. You speak like a man who has no one depending on him for protection. But what of the other brothers? What of the novices? What of the pilgrims who seek sanctuary within these walls? Would you sacrifice all of them for the satisfaction of speaking truth to power? It is the eternal question that faces all who would resist tyranny, the terrible arithmetic of moral choice that weighs individual conscience against collective safety. Francis has no answer, but Aldrich looks up from his parchment with eyes that reflect years of grappling with such impossibilities. We sacrifice them anyway if we remain silent, he says quietly. For what is the value of sanctuary that protects only the body while surrendering the soul? What safety can we offer if we ourselves become accomplices to injustice? The debate continues in whispers, but even as they argue, the work continues. Other monks take up pens, some copying Aldrich's words, others adding their own observations, their own testimonies to the corruption they have witnessed. The chronicle of royal justice grows from individual witness to collective testimony, from personal confession to communal resistance. By afternoon, the chroniclers have attracted the attention of the abbey's highest authority, Dom Geoffrey, the abbot himself, whose word within these walls carries weight second only to God's. He approaches the growing group of scribes with the measured step of a man who has learned to balance competing authorities, earthly and divine. What transpires here, brothers? The abbot asks, though his tone suggests he already knows the answer. We write what must be written, Father, Aldrich replies, rising from his lectern to bow respectfully to his superior. We preserve what must be preserved. We bear witness to what we have seen. Dom Geoffrey examines the growing chronicle, his eyes moving across the careful script with the practiced attention of a scholar who has spent his life with books. His face reveals nothing, but his silence speaks volumes about the gravity of what he reads. "This is sedition," he says finally, though his tone carries no condemnation. "By any measure of earthly law, these words constitute rebellion against lawful authority." "Yes, Father," Aldrich agrees without hesitation. "But by any measure of divine law, silence in the face of injustice constitutes rebellion against God." The abbot continues reading, and as he does, something in his expression begins to change. The careful neutrality of ecclesiastical diplomacy gives way to something more human, more personal, the response of a man confronting truth too clear to be denied. "The Duke was a good man," Dom Geoffrey says at last, his voice barely above a whisper. "I knew him well in his youth. He was devout, generous to the Church, faithful in his service to the realm. If such a man can be branded traitor and brought to the block—" He trails off, leaving the implication unspoken but clearly understood. "Then any man can," Brother Francis completes the thought. "And the law becomes not a protection for the innocent, but a weapon in the hands of the powerful." The abbot nods slowly, recognizing in the young monk's words an echo of his own fears. He has spent his life serving God through service to the Church, but the Church exists within the realm, subject to royal authority in matters temporal if not spiritual. How long before a king who kills uncles for honesty decides that abbots who harbor uncomfortable truths pose an equal threat? "Continue your work," Dom Geoffrey says finally, his words carrying the weight of official sanction. "But take care, extraordinary care, that what you write serves truth rather than passion, history rather than politics, God rather than any earthly master." With those words, the Chronicle of Royal Justice receives the blessing of the highest ecclesiastical authority in England, transforming individual witness into official record. The implications are staggering. The Church itself, through its highest representative, has chosen to preserve and protect testimony that condemns royal justice as corrupt. As evening approaches and the light from the narrow windows begins to fade, the work continues by candlelight. The scribes labor with the intensity of men who know they are racing against time, preserving truth before it can be lost or suppressed. Their pens scratch across parchment like tiny swords, each letter a small victory over the forces that would prefer silence to testimony, darkness to illumination. "It is finished," Aldrich announces as midnight bells toll across the abbey. Before him lies not just a chronicle but a testament, dozens of pages filled with careful script that records not just the death of one duke, but the corruption of an entire system of justice. The assembled monks gather around the completed work, reading by candlelight words that seem to glow with their own inner fire. They have created something dangerous and beautiful, something that speaks truth to power with a voice that cannot be silenced by royal decree. "What now?" asks Brother Francis, exhaustion and exhilaration warring in his young face. "Now we hide it," Aldrich replies, already gathering the precious pages. "We hide it well, in places where royal searchers cannot find it, protected by stone and darkness and the accumulated secrecy of centuries. And we wait." "Wait for what?" Aldrich looks around at the circle of faces illuminated by flickering candles, seeing in them the same mixture of hope and terror that he feels in his own heart. "For the day when such testimony is needed. For the time when men will ask how tyranny was allowed to flourish, how justice became vengeance, how divine right transformed into mortal oppression. When that day comes, our words will speak for us, bearing witness to what we have seen, testifying to truths that power would prefer forgotten." The candles burn lower, casting ever longer shadows across the scriptorium's ancient stones. But the work is done, the testimony complete, the chronicle written. Hidden away in secret places throughout the abbey, protected by men who have chosen truth over safety, it will wait like a seed in winter ground, ready to grow when spring finally comes. In the growing darkness, the scribes disperse to their cells, carrying with them the dangerous satisfaction that comes from having chosen conscience over comfort, principle over prudence. They have written what history demanded, preserved what truth required, testified to what justice commanded. Whatever comes next, royal displeasure or divine judgment, earthly punishment, or eternal reward, they have done what they could to ensure that the truth survives, hidden but not lost, waiting for the dawn that must eventually come. The chronicle of royal justice rests now in darkness, but its words burn with a light that no royal authority can extinguish. They will outlive the king who inspired them, outlast the kingdom that condemned them, and speak to ages yet unborn of the eternal struggle between power and principle, between authority and truth, between the kingdoms of this world and the kingdom of heaven that stands in judgment over them all. In the dim heart of London Southwark, where the Thames flows dark and slow beneath London Bridge, the Tabard squats like a faithful hound beside the Dover Road. Its timbers, blackened by centuries of smoke and stained with the honest sweat of countless travelers, have sheltered pilgrims bound for Canterbury, merchants journeying to distant fairs, and tonight, in the flickering light of tallow candles that cast dancing shadows against walls scarred by time, a gathering more dangerous than any the inn has ever harbored. They come by ones and twos through the November darkness, these men who dare to question what others accept without thought. Thomas Miller, whose hands bear the permanent stain of grain, and whose back knows the weight of sacks that feed London's thousands. William Fletcher, whose skilled fingers shape the arrows that defend England's borders but whose heart grows heavy with questions about the justice those arrows serve. Robert Carpenter, whose tools build the houses where subjects sleep fitfully, dreaming uneasy dreams of scaffolds and royal judgment. The common room fills with a tension thick as morning fog, heavy with unspoken thoughts that have festered since that terrible dawn when Duke Thomas lost his head to royal justice. These are not learned men, not scholars who debate philosophy in university halls, not courtiers who speak in carefully crafted phrases designed to avoid giving offense. These are the people whose labor feeds the realm, whose sweat builds its buildings, whose blood has watered its battlefields, and whose silence, until now, has been taken for granted. "Speak your minds freely," says John Ball, the priest whose very presence here transforms this gathering from mere conversation into something approaching sedition. Ball wears the rough brown robe of a hedge priest, one of those wandering clerics who serve the poor because the rich have no need of their uncomfortable truths. His face bears the lines that come to men who have seen too much suffering and decided that silence is complicity. "Freely?" Miller's laugh carries no humor, only the bitter recognition of a man who understands how little freedom subjects actually possess. "There's precious little freedom left in England for those of us who work with our hands and think with our hearts." Around the room, heads nod in grim agreement. These men have heard the official proclamations, the royal justifications for the Duke's execution. They have listened to priests speak of divine right and lawful authority, to sheriffs warn of the consequences of questioning royal judgment. But they have also seen the truth with their own eyes, felt it in their bones, known it in their hearts, the growing distance between rulers and ruled, the transformation of justice into tyranny. "I knew the Duke," says Fletcher quietly, his voice carrying the weight of personal loss. "Served under him in France during the old King's wars. He was a good commander, fair with his men, quick to share hardship and slow to claim more than his portion of glory." He pauses, staring into the depths of his ale as if seeking answers in the dark liquid. "If such a man can be branded traitor and brought to the block, what safety is there for any of us?" It is the question that haunts every gathering of subjects in this age of royal paranoia. The recognition that arbitrary power, once unleashed, recognizes no natural limits, respects no traditional boundaries. The axe that falls on ducal necks today may fall on common necks tomorrow, if common voices dare to speak uncomfortable truths. "Safety?" Ball's voice cuts through the gloom like a blade through cloth. "There is no safety for those who serve injustice, no security for those who profit from oppression. We have sold our souls for the illusion of peace, bartered our consciences for the promise of prosperity. But what profit a man if he gain the whole world and lose his soul?" The biblical reference hangs in the smoky air, but its meaning extends far beyond Scripture. These men understand, perhaps better than their betters, the terrible mathematics of moral compromise, the way small surrenders of principle accumulate until the soul itself becomes bankrupt, until conscience dies so gradually that its passing goes unnoticed. "Pretty words, priest," growls Carpenter, his scarred hands gripping his tankard with the strength that comes from a lifetime of wielding hammer and saw. "But words don't put food in children's bellies or thatch on cottage roofs." We may not like the king's justice, but it's the only justice we have. Challenge it, and we lose everything. And keeping silent preserves what, exactly? Miller demands, his voice rising with passion kept too long suppressed. The right to watch good men die. The privilege of seeing justice corrupted into vengeance? The freedom to bow our heads while tyrants claim divine authority for their crimes? The debate that follows is not the polite discourse of scholars or the calculated maneuvering of courtiers. It is the raw, honest wrestling of common men with impossible choices, the eternal struggle between conscience and survival, between principle and prudence, between the demands of the soul and the needs of the flesh. Some argue for patience, for waiting until times change, for trusting that royal authority will moderate itself if given sufficient time and space. Others speak with the fierce urgency of men who have seen enough injustice to know that power never surrenders itself willingly, that tyrants only grow more tyrannical if their tyranny meets no resistance. My grandfather fought at Cressy, says young Tom Weaver, barely 20 years in the world but already marked by the particular wisdom that comes to those who must work hard for their daily bread. He used to tell stories of how the longbow in common hands could bring down French knights in all their steel and pride. Said it proved that English yeomen were the equal of any lord when it came to serving the realm. He pauses, looking around the circle of weathered faces, seeing in them the same mixture of fear and determination that must have marked English archers before that famous battle. But what good are our bows against English tyranny? He continues. What use is yeoman courage against royal injustice? My grandfather's generation fought foreign enemies. We face something harder, the enemy that claims to rule us by divine right. The observation strikes deep, touching the heart of the dilemma that faces all subjects who live under absolute authority. Foreign enemies can be fought with clear conscience, defeated with honest pride. But domestic tyrants present impossible choices. To resist is rebellion, but to submit is complicity. Perhaps, says Ball slowly, his voice carrying the careful weight of a man who has thought long and hard about such matters. The real question is not whether we should resist, but whether we can continue to live with ourselves if we do not. Silence falls over the common room, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant sound of the Thames flowing toward the sea. In that silence, each man wrestles with his own conscience, his own calculation of risk and responsibility, his own understanding of what it means to be human in an age when humanity itself seems subject to royal decree. I have children, says Miller finally, his voice heavy with the weight of paternal responsibility. 3 daughters who depend on me for their bread, their shelter, their futures. If I speak against the king's justice and bring royal attention down upon my head, what becomes of them? It is the argument that has silenced countless potential rebels throughout history. The recognition that individual conscience exists within a web of relationships and responsibilities that extend far beyond the self. The childless may choose martyrdom with relative ease, but fathers and mothers face calculations infinitely more complex. And what becomes of them? Ball responds gently. If we allow injustice to flourish unchallenged, what kind of world do we leave our children if we teach them that might makes right, that power justifies itself, that royal authority admits no limits? The question hangs between them like a challenge, like a prayer, like an accusation that cannot be answered with simple logic. For both perspectives carry truth, the immediate truth of family responsibility and the larger truth of moral obligation, the personal truth of love for children and the universal truth of duty to future generations. There must be another way, says Fletcher with the desperate hope of a man seeking alternatives to impossible choices. Some path between cowardly silence and suicidal defiance. We cannot fight the king directly. His armies would crush us like wheat beneath millstones. But surely there are other forms of resistance, other ways of bearing witness to truth. Such as? Carpenter demands, his skepticism evident in every line of his weathered face. Fletcher hesitates, groping for words to express thoughts that are still forming in his mind. What if we simply refused to participate? What if we withdrew our cooperation from the machinery of injustice? Not rebellion exactly, but resistance through absence. The idea sparks debate that continues deep into the night. Some see wisdom in Fletcher's proposal. The notion that tyranny requires complicity, that royal power depends ultimately upon subject cooperation, that withdrawal of consent might be more powerful than armed resistance. Others argue that such passive resistance is mere self-delusion, that power based on force cannot be defeated by anything less than equal force. You speak of withdrawing cooperation, says Ball thoughtfully. But what does that mean in practice? The king's taxes must still be paid. Refusal means imprisonment or death. His laws must still be obeyed. Defiance brings royal justice down upon the defiant head. His authority must still be acknowledged, challenge it, and face the consequences we saw demonstrated upon the scaffold. But there are spaces, Miller insists, his voice growing stronger with conviction. Small spaces where choice remains possible. How we speak to our children about royal justice. How we conduct our own affairs, govern our own behavior, treat our neighbors and fellow subjects. The king may command our bodies, but he cannot command our souls, not unless we surrender them willingly. It is a modest hope, perhaps, but in an age of absolute authority, even modest hopes carry revolutionary potential. The idea that individual conscience remains inviolate, that some part of human nature lies beyond royal reach, challenges the very foundations of medieval sovereignty. As the night advances toward dawn, the gathering begins to take on the character of something unprecedented in English history, not a conspiracy of nobles plotting rebellion, not a council of war planning armed resistance, but a communion of common folk refusing to accept that royal will and divine justice are identical, that earthly authority and heavenly mandate are one and the same. We may not be able to change the world, says young Tom Weaver as the candles burn low and the fire settles into glowing coals. But we can refuse to let the world change us. We can preserve, in our hearts and homes, the knowledge of what justice actually looks like, and pass that knowledge to our children, who may live to see times when such knowledge becomes precious beyond gold. The gathering disperses as London begins to stir with the approaching dawn. But the men who leave the tabard carry with them something they did not possess when they entered, a sense of community and resistance, a recognition that they are not alone in their doubts and questions, an understanding that the foundations of royal authority may be less secure than they appear. In the days that follow, word spreads through London's workshops and markets, taverns and churches, carrying the whispered message that resistance is possible, that conscience need not be surrendered to authority, that even in an age of absolute monarchy, the human soul retains the right to judge between right and wrong. The message travels along the trade routes that connect London to the countryside, carried by merchants and craftsmen, pilgrims and wandering friars, finding fertile ground in hearts that have grown weary of accepting injustice as the natural order of things. In village squares and manor halls, in guild halls and parish churches, the same conversations begin to unfold. Quiet debates between conscience and survival, whispered challenges to the divine right of kings. The royal court, secure in its power and confident in its authority, takes little notice of these stirrings among the common folk. Kings and courtiers concern themselves with grander matters, foreign policy and court intrigue, noble marriages and clerical appointments. The thoughts and feelings of subjects who work with their hands seem as irrelevant as the opinions of cattle or sheep. But beneath the surface of apparent calm, something fundamental is changing in the relationship between ruler and ruled. The execution of Thomas of Woodstock has accomplished precisely the opposite of what it was intended to achieve. Instead of demonstrating the futility of resistance, it has revealed the human cost of absolute power. Instead of inspiring fear, it has awakened conscience. Instead of securing royal authority, it has planted the seeds of its eventual undoing. For in the hearts of common folk across England, a dangerous idea is taking root. The idea that power, however absolute, however sanctified by custom and blessed by priests, remains ultimately accountable to something higher than itself. It may be years or decades before that idea flowers into open resistance, but the seed has been planted, watered with the blood of a duke who died for speaking truth to power. The chronicle of royal justice rests hidden in the scriptorium of Westminster Abbey, preserved by monks who chose conscience over safety. But its true copy lives now in the hearts of subjects who have begun to remember that they are more than merely subject. They are human beings, created in the image of God, endowed with reason and conscience, and the inalienable right to distinguish between justice and its corruption. The king sits secure upon his throne, master of armies and fleets, commander of nobles and commons alike. His will is law throughout the realm, his authority unquestioned by any who value their lives. Yet in the very completeness of his victory lies the seed of eventual defeat, for power that rests on fear alone carries within itself the guarantee of its own destruction, and tyranny, however absolute, cannot finally overcome the human hunger for justice, dignity, and truth. The whisper that began in the tabard grows stronger with each telling, spreading like fire through dry grass, carrying with it the dangerous message that subjects need not accept injustice simply because it wears a crown, that conscience remains free even when the body is enslaved, that the kingdom of heaven stands in eternal judgment over all earthly kingdoms, even those that claim divine appointment. Winter grips England in iron claws, and in the royal palace of Sheen, King Richard II paces the length of his private chamber like a caged wolf, his footsteps echoing against stones that seem to grow colder with each passing day. Beyond the tall windows, snow falls in the darkness, each flake a tiny messenger of the season that makes beggars of kings and equals of all men beneath its white shroud. But the cold that chills the king's bones comes not from winter's breath, it comes from within, from the growing recognition that absolute power, once achieved, brings not satisfaction but a peculiar form of torment. The chamber around him bears witness to the accumulated weight of royal authority. Tapestries that tell the story of conquest, gold plate that reflects the light of 100 candles, artifacts of power gathered from across the known world. Yet for all its splendor, the room feels more like a tomb than a palace, more like a prison than the seat of sovereignty. The silence here is not peaceful but oppressive, heavy with unspoken thoughts and suppressed truths that grow more dangerous with each day of denial. A knock at the chamber door brings momentary relief from the king's brooding, but the relief dies quickly when Sir John Bushy enters, his face bearing the particular expression that courtiers wear when they must deliver unwelcome news to men who possess the power of life and death. "Your Grace," Bushy says, bowing low enough to demonstrate proper submission while calculating how to present information that no king wants to hear. "I bring reports from the sheriffs of the northern counties." Richard does not pause in his pacing, but his attention sharpens like a blade being drawn from its sheath. In recent months he has learned to dread such reports, for they invariably speak of unrest, dissatisfaction, the quiet but persistent erosion of the unquestioning obedience that absolute authority requires. "Speak plainly," the king commands, his voice carrying an edge that would have reduced lesser men to stammering terror. "What poison do my loving subjects whisper in their northern hovels?" Bushy swallows hard, recognizing the danger inherent in delivering such news while understanding that concealment would be even more perilous. "They speak, Your Grace, of the late Duke of Gloucester. His name has become a rallying cry of sorts. A symbol. A symbol of what?" Richard's voice drops to the deadly quiet that experienced courtiers know presages either mercy or destruction, with little to choose between them. "Of opposition to royal authority, Your Grace. Of resistance to what they term arbitrary justice." The words hang in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, carrying with them the acrid scent of rebellion, the bitter taste of subjects who have forgotten their proper place in the order of creation. Richard stops his pacing at last, turning to face his messenger with eyes that burn like coals in the pale oval of his face. "Arbitrary justice," he repeats slowly, as if testing the flavor of each word. "They dare to call the judgment of their anointed king arbitrary? The reports speak of questions, Your Grace. Common folk who wonder why a duke who served faithfully should die for speaking truth. Priests who preach sermons about the difference between earthly authority and divine will. Merchants who whisper in their guild halls about the security of property when royal favor can shift like weather." Each word falls into the chamber's silence like a stone into still water, sending ripples of implication spreading outward until they touch the very foundations of royal power. Richard moves to the window, pressing his forehead against the cold glass as if the winter's chill might freeze the thoughts that burn in his brain like fever. "And what do the sheriffs recommend?" he asks, though his tone suggests he already knows the answer. "Arrest, Your Grace. Public trials. Demonstrations of royal power that will remind the commons of their proper obedience. Bushy's voice carries little enthusiasm for such measures, but he delivers them with the mechanical precision of a man who has learned to separate personal feelings from professional duty. Richard laughs, but the sound carries no humor, only the bitter recognition of a man who has discovered that the instruments of power, once wielded, tend to demand ever greater use. More executions, then. More scaffolds. More demonstrations of the royal justice they dare to question. It would send a clear message, Your Grace. Would it? Richard turns from the window, his face reflecting the cold light that filters through the glass. Or would it simply confirm what they whisper in their taverns and markets? That their king rules through fear alone, that royal authority rests upon the scaffold rather than upon divine appointment? The question reveals more than Richard perhaps intends, the growing doubt that eats at him like acid, the terrible uncertainty that comes to men who discover that absolute power brings not peace but endless vigilance, not security but perpetual fear of those over whom power is exercised. Your Grace, Bushy ventures carefully. Perhaps a different approach might serve better. Acts of royal mercy, pardons for those who have spoken unwisely, demonstrations of kingly magnanimity that might win back the love of your subjects. Love? The word explodes from Richard's lips like a curse. What use is love that must be purchased with weakness? What value is affection that depends upon royal surrender? I have tried mercy, Bushy, mercy toward rebellious uncles, tolerance toward questioning subjects. And what did such mercy earn me? Greater rebellion, deeper questions, more widespread resistance to lawful authority. The king moves away from the window, resuming his restless pacing, but now his movements carry a different quality, not the nervous energy of anxiety, but the deliberate stride of a man who has reached a decision, however terrible its implications. They call my justice arbitrary, he continues, his voice growing stronger with each word. They question the divine right that places the crown upon my head. They forget that kings rule not by the consent of subjects but by the will of God, that royal authority flows not from earthly affection but from celestial appointment. Your Grace. No. Richard's voice cuts through Bushy's attempted interruption like a sword through silk. I have heard enough counsel, enough suggestions, enough gentle recommendations that I soften what requires hardening, that I moderate what demands absolute resolution. If my subjects require lessons in obedience, then by God's blood they shall have them. The transformation that comes over the king is terrible to witness, the last vestiges of uncertainty burning away like mist before the sun, leaving behind something harder and more dangerous than mere tyranny. This is the birth of something new in the long history of English kingship, not merely arbitrary rule, but the conscious embrace of arbitrariness as a tool of governance, the deliberate cultivation of unpredictability as a weapon of control. Send word to all sheriffs, Richard commands, his voice carrying the finality of iron striking stone. Let it be proclaimed throughout the realm that the king's justice knows no seasons, recognizes no limits, makes no distinction between high and low, noble and common, guilty and merely suspected. Any man who speaks against royal authority, any woman who questions royal judgment, any child who fails to demonstrate proper reverence for the crown, all shall face the consequences of their presumption. Bushy's face pales as he recognizes the implications of such an order. To enforce it would require transforming England into a vast network of spies and informants, subjects watching subjects, every word weighed for potential treason, every gesture examined for signs of insufficient loyalty. It would mean the death of whatever trust still exists between ruler and ruled, the final severing of bonds that have held the realm together since time beyond memory. Your Grace, he attempts one last protest. Such measures would demonstrate beyond question that royal authority admits no challenge, accepts no limitation, tolerates no questioning. Richard moves to a great oak table where maps of England lie spread like captured territories, his finger tracing boundaries that have become meaningless in the face of absolute power. They wish to know what arbitrary justice looks like. Then let them learn through experience what their questioning has purchased. The order, once given, spreads through the machinery of royal government like poison through a well. Sheriffs receive their instructions with the grim understanding of men who must choose between their own survival and their conscience. Some comply eagerly, seeing opportunity in the king's paranoia. Others obey reluctantly, recognizing that resistance means joining the growing ranks of those marked for royal attention. In villages and towns across England, the effects are swift and terrible. The blacksmith who once grumbled about royal taxes finds himself dragged before magistrates on charges of sedition. The merchant who questioned the justice of the Duke's execution disappears in the night, leaving behind only whispers and a family too terrified to ask questions. The priest who preached about divine mercy discovers that earthly power recognizes no authority higher than itself. But terror, like fire, consumes more than its intended targets. In seeking to crush all resistance, the king's justice begins to devour the very foundations upon which royal authority rests. The merchants who finance royal government grow afraid to trade freely, lest some casual word be construed as treason. The nobles who staff royal administration begin to calculate the costs of continued service against the risks of remaining too close to a crown that has lost all sense of proportion. In the scriptorium of Westminster Abbey, Brother Aldrich adds new pages to his hidden chronicle, his pen scratching across parchment with the urgency of a man who fears that truth itself is becoming an endangered species. The chronicle of royal justice grows darker with each entry, documenting not merely the death of one duke but the systematic destruction of the compact between king and subject that has made England possible. The king has become drunk with power, he writes, his careful script belying the revolutionary nature of his words, forgetting that earthly authority, however absolute it may appear, remains ultimately accountable to divine judgment. In seeking to play God, he has revealed himself to be merely human, and not the best example of humanity at that. The winter deepens, bringing with it a cold that seems to seep into the very bones of the kingdom. In the royal palace, Richard sits surrounded by the trappings of absolute power, master of a realm that grows more silent with each passing day. But the silence is not the peace of contentment. It is the hush that comes before storms, the quiet that precedes earthquakes, the stillness that marks the moment between the lightning's flash and thunder's roar. Word reaches the court of disturbances in the north. Not open rebellion, for the king's terror has been too effective for that, but something more subtle and perhaps more dangerous. Entire villages have begun to empty, their inhabitants fleeing to Scotland or Ireland or simply disappearing into the forests that still cover much of England. Trade slows as merchants grow afraid to travel roads where any chance encounter with royal agents might prove fatal. They run like rabbits, Richard observes to his remaining courtiers, but his voice carries less satisfaction than might be expected. They scatter before the majesty of royal justice like chaff before the wind. Yet even as he speaks, doubt gnaws at him like a cancer. A king without subjects is no king at all, and subjects who flee rather than submit represent a different kind of rebellion, not the direct challenge that can be met with steel and scaffold, but the quiet withdrawal that leaves authority speaking to empty air. In the great hall where once nobles gathered to seek royal favor, fewer and fewer petitioners present themselves. Those who do come speak in whispers, their words carefully chosen to avoid giving offense, their manner suggesting men walking on ice that grows thinner with each step. The brilliant pageantry of royal ceremony continues, but it begins to feel like a performance played to empty seats, a ritual that has lost its meaning even as it maintains its form. "Your Grace," ventures Sir Thomas Holland, one of the few courtiers who still dares to speak honestly to his king. "Perhaps the time has come to consider moderation. The realm grows quiet, perhaps too quiet. Silence can be as dangerous as rebellion, for it suggests that subjects have lost faith not merely in royal policy but in royal authority itself." Richard's response is swift and terrible. Within hours, Holland finds himself charged with treason, not for plotting against the crown, but for the greater crime of suggesting that royal authority might be subject to question, that kingly power might have limits, that divine right might require earthly wisdom in its application. The trial, if it can be called such, lasts less than an hour. No evidence is presented because none is required. The king's word is evidence enough, his judgment final and absolute. Holland dies with dignity, as becomes a knight, but his death sends a message that penetrates to the furthest corners of the realm. Not even the most loyal service, the most faithful devotion, offers protection against a crown that has lost all sense of proportion. Yet in destroying Holland, Richard destroys something else as well, the last vestiges of the ancient contract between king and nobility that has governed England since the Norman conquest. The great lords who once served the crown with enthusiasm now calculate their own survival, recognizing that royal favor has become as dangerous as royal displeasure, that service to such a king offers no security, no protection, no hope of peaceful retirement. In secret chambers and hidden corners, conversations begin that would have been unthinkable only months before. Not yet open conspiracy, but something that might, in time, grow into such: the quiet recognition that a king who rules through terror alone has forfeited the loyalty that makes kingship possible. "He is mad," whispers the Earl of Derby, son of John of Gaunt, grandson of kings, and increasingly aware that noble blood offers no protection against royal paranoia. Not mad in the way of fools, but mad in the way of tyrants who have forgotten that power serves purpose beyond itself. The whisper spreads through noble circles like ripples from a stone cast into still water. Not yet rebellion, not yet conspiracy, but the beginning of recognition that the kingdom suffers under a king who has mistaken fear for respect, terror for authority, arbitrary power for divine right. Spring comes late to England in the year 1388, and when it finally arrives, it brings with it the first stirrings of organized resistance to Richard's reign of terror. Not the chaotic uprising of desperate peasants, but something far more dangerous: the calculated opposition of men who understand power and know how to wield it, nobles who have decided that a king who destroys the very foundations of royal authority must be stopped before he destroys the kingdom itself. The rebellion, when it comes, will not spring from the commons who have borne the brunt of royal oppression, but from the very class that has traditionally served as the crown's strongest support. It will be led not by radical priests or desperate peasants, but by the great lords of England who have concluded that their oath of loyalty binds them to the crown, not to the man who wears it, and that when the man betrays the crown, loyalty demands his removal. But that is a story for another day, another chronicle, another testimony to the eternal truth that power without justice is tyranny, and tyranny, however absolute, carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction. For now, it is enough to record that in the winter of Richard's discontent, the medieval world learned a lesson that echoes through all ages: that kings who claim divine right must exercise divine wisdom, that authority without accountability becomes oppression, and that subjects, however patient, however long-suffering, retain always the ultimate power to withdraw their consent from rulers who have forgotten that they rule by grace, not by right. The chronicle of royal justice closes on this note of gathering storm, its pages filled with the testimony of an age when law and royal will were one, when justice wore a crown, and when that crown grew so heavy with arbitrary power that it finally crushed the head that wore it. Hidden away in monastery walls, protected by monks who chose conscience over safety, it waits for future generations to read and learn and remember that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, and the cost of absolute power is absolute corruption. In the darkness of his palace chamber, King Richard II sits alone with his thoughts, master of a realm that grows more silent with each passing day. Outside his windows, England sleeps the uneasy sleep of subjects who have learned to fear their king more than their enemies, who whisper prayers for deliverance from the very authority that once promised them protection. The crown still gleams upon the royal head, but it has become what it was always destined to become when divorced from justice, separated from mercy, and transformed into an instrument of terror, not a symbol of divine appointment, but a crown of thorns that wounds the head that wears it even as it crushes the hearts of those who must bow before its terrible majesty. The wheel of fortune turns, as it always does, and kings who climb too high discover that the fall, when it comes, is both swift and final. But that is another story, for another time, when the chronicles of rebellion replace the chronicles of tyranny, and the kingdom learns once again that power belongs ultimately not to those who seize it, but to those who deserve it, and that desert is measured not by the strength to compel obedience, but by the wisdom to earn it, the justice to maintain it, and the mercy to temper it with the recognition that all earthly authority remains subject to the judgment of heaven, which weighs not. Crowns but hearts, not power but righteousness, not the fear of subjects but the love of justice that makes authority legitimate, and power worthy of the obedience it commands. The great bell of St. Paul's Cathedral tolls across London with a voice like thunder, but this morning its bronze song carries more than the call to prayer. It carries the knell of a dynasty, the death note of absolute authority, the funeral hymn of a kingship that has devoured itself in its hunger for unlimited power. The year is 1399, and England trembles on the edge of transformation, balanced between the old world of divine right and unquestioning obedience, and something new, something that will reshape the very foundations of royal authority for centuries to come. In the Tower of London, in the same chamber where Thomas of Woodstock once knelt before his nephew's judgment, King Richard II paces the narrow confines of what was once a throne room and has become a prison. The irony is too perfect, too complete. The man who claimed absolute authority over life and death now awaits the decision of others. The king who ruled through fear now tastes its bitter flavor on his own tongue. The chamber looks smaller than memory suggests, its stone walls seeming to press inward like the sides of a tomb. The throne still stands where Richard placed it 12 years ago, but it appears diminished now, less a seat of majesty than a piece of furniture, empty and meaningless without the authority to give it significance. The tapestries that once proclaimed royal triumph hang in tatters, their bright threads faded, their heroic scenes mocked by present reality. Through the narrow window comes the sound of London awakening, not the fearful silence that has marked the city for months, but something different, something that speaks of hope returning after long darkness. In the streets below, people move with a freedom they had forgotten was possible, speak with voices that no longer drop to whispers at mention of royal justice, look toward the future with eyes that have begun to lose their fear. A key turns in the chamber door, and Henry Bolingbroke enters, Henry of Lancaster, son of John of Gaunt, grandson of Edward III, and now, by the grace of God and the will of the English people, King Henry IV. He wears no crown, bears no scepter, claims no divine mandate, only the quiet authority that comes to men who have earned power rather than inherited it, who understand that true kingship serves the realm rather than the reverse. "Cousin," Henry says simply, the word carrying neither mockery nor malice, only the weight of relationship acknowledged despite all that has passed between them. Richard looks up from his pacing, and for a moment the two men, king deposed and king ascendant, regard each other across the ruins of absolute monarchy. In Richard's eyes burns something that might be anger or might be relief, the complex emotion of a man who has carried a burden too great for any human shoulders and finds himself finally, inevitably, forced to set it down. "Have you come to gloat?" Richard asks, his voice carrying the peculiar dignity that sometimes comes to those who have lost everything and thus have nothing left to lose. "I have come to understand," Henry replies, moving to the window and looking out at the London that sprawls below the tower's ancient walls. "To understand how we came to this place, this moment when cousin must judge cousin, when subjects must rise against their anointed king." The words hang in the chamber's stale air, heavy with implications that extend far beyond the personal tragedy of two royal cousins. This is not merely the fall of one king and the rise of another, it is the death of an idea, the end of the medieval notion that royal authority flows unquestioned from heaven to earth, that kings rule by divine appointment rather than earthly consent. "You know why," Richard says, settling into the chair that was once his throne, the gesture both defiant and defeated. "You know what I became, what the crown made me become. The weight of absolute power, the necessity of maintaining authority through fear, the terrible isolation that comes when every subject becomes a potential threat. You think you understand, but you have not yet worn the crown long enough to feel its true weight." Henry turns from the window, his face reflecting the thoughtful gravity of a man who has indeed begun to feel that weight, to understand the terrible responsibilities that come with ultimate authority. "Perhaps not. But I have watched what it did to you, seen how it transformed a man I once knew into something else entirely, not evil, exactly, but diminished. Made less than human by the very power that was supposed to elevate you above humanity." The observation strikes deep, touching something in Richard that has remained hidden even from himself, the recognition that in claiming divine authority, he had surrendered human wisdom. In demanding absolute obedience, he had lost the capacity to inspire willing service. In ruling through fear, he had made himself into something feared and therefore something that could never be loved. The Chronicle of Royal Justice, Richard says suddenly, the words seeming to surprise him as much as they surprise Henry. You know of it? Henry nods slowly. The monks of Westminster have shown it to me. A remarkable document, dangerous in its honesty, revolutionary in its implications. Brother Aldrich writes with the pen of a prophet, recording not just events but their meaning, not just what happened but what it means for the future of kingship itself. And what does it say about me? Richard asks, though his tone suggests he already knows the answer. That you were a man who mistook power for authority, force for legitimacy, fear for respect. That you forgot the ancient truth that kings rule not because they can compel obedience, but because they deserve it, and that desert must be earned anew by each generation, each decision, each act of royal judgment. The words fall into silence like stones into deep water, sending ripples of recognition through the chamber's oppressive stillness. In them lies the epitaph of absolute monarchy, the recognition that divine right means nothing without earthly wisdom, that royal authority depends ultimately upon the consent of the governed. I did what I thought necessary, Richard says finally, his voice carrying the weary defensiveness of a man who has justified his actions so often that he no longer remembers what they were supposed to achieve. The realm required strong leadership, decisive action, the kind of authority that brooked no questioning. The realm required justice, Henry corrects gently. Not the arbitrary exercise of royal will, but the careful application of law and mercy, wisdom and restraint. The realm required a king who served something higher than his own power, who understood that authority is a trust, not a possession. Pretty words, Richard replies with a flash of his old arrogance. But how will your justice differ from mine? How will your authority avoid the corruptions that destroyed mine? You sit where I sat, hold what I held, claim what I claimed. What makes you think you can succeed where I failed? It is the crucial question, the one that will determine whether Henry's reign marks a genuine transformation in the nature of royal authority, or merely replaces one tyrant with another. Henry considers his answer carefully, recognizing that his words will be remembered, that they will shape expectations and define the limits of his own power. Because I do not rule alone, he says at last. Because I understand that royal authority must be shared, must be limited, must be subject to the advice of those it serves. Because I have learned from your failure that absolute power corrupts absolutely, that kings who claim divine right must exercise divine wisdom, and that such wisdom comes not from isolation but from counsel, not from fear but from trust. The declaration marks a watershed moment in English history, the first explicit acknowledgement by a king that royal power has limits, that subjects have rights, that authority flows not merely from heaven but from the people who must live under its exercise. It will not immediately transform England into a democracy, that lies centuries in the future, but it plants the seed from which constitutional monarchy will eventually grow. Parliament, Richard observes with something approaching amusement. You mean to work with Parliament, to share power with merchants and lawyers, to limit your own authority for the sake of their approval. I mean to rule with consent rather than compulsion, Henry corrects. To build authority that rests on legitimacy rather than fear. To govern in such a way that when I die, I leave behind not subjects who celebrate their liberation from tyranny, but citizens who mourn the loss of a king who served them well. The contrast could not be sharper between the old model of kingship that Richard represented and the new model that Henry promises to establish. One based on the divine right of kings to rule as they choose, the other on the earthly obligation of kings to serve those they govern. One rooted in the medieval notion of absolute authority, the other pointing toward a more modern understanding of limited government and shared power. You will fail, Richard predicts with the bitter certainty of a man who has learned the true cost of royal authority. The crown corrupts all who wear it, transforms the best of men into tyrants, makes monsters of those who begin with the noblest intentions. Give it time, cousin, give it time, and you will become what I became, do what I did, make the same choices that brought me to this chamber. Perhaps, Henry acknowledges with a humility that would have been impossible for Richard at the height of his power. Perhaps the corruption of power is inevitable, perhaps absolute authority cannot coexist with human wisdom. But perhaps also the knowledge of that danger offers some protection against it. Perhaps recognizing the temptation makes it possible to resist it, at least for a time. The conversation continues as the day advances toward evening, two kings, one fallen, one ascendant, wrestling with questions that will plague rulers for centuries to come. How to exercise authority without becoming tyrannical. How to maintain order without destroying freedom. How to serve the needs of the realm without losing touch with the people who inhabit it. As darkness falls over London, Henry prepares to leave the Tower, to return to the palace and the throne that await his attention. At the chamber door, he pauses, looking back at the man who was once King of England and is now merely Richard Plantagenet, former monarch, fallen tyrant, object lesson in the dangers of absolute power. There will be no scaffold, Henry says quietly. No public execution, no royal vengeance dressed up as justice. You will live out your days in comfortable exile, forgotten perhaps, but not martyred. History will judge your reign, but it will not make you into a saint through the manner of your death. Richard nods, recognizing in Henry's mercy something that was rarely present in his own justice. Restraint, proportion, the understanding that true authority proves itself not through the exercise of maximum power but through the wisdom to limit that exercise. It is a lesson learned too late for Richard, but perhaps not too late for England. The door closes with a sound like finality itself, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts and his memories. But beyond these walls, England awakens to something new, not immediately, not completely, but with the slow certainty of dawn breaking after the longest night. The age of absolute monarchy has not ended, that will take centuries more, but it has been wounded, perhaps fatally, by the recognition that power without accountability is tyranny, and tyranny, however absolute, cannot finally overcome the human longing for justice, dignity, and truth. In the scriptorium of Westminster Abbey, Brother Aldrich dips his pen in fresh ink and begins to write the final pages of his chronicle of royal justice. But these pages tell a different story from those that came before, not the tale of justice corrupted and authority abused, but the first tentative steps towards something better, something that recognizes both the necessity of government and the dangers of unlimited power. The wheel of fortune has turned, he writes, his careful script recording the transformation of a kingdom, and with it has turned also the wheel of understanding. We have learned, at terrible cost, that earthly authority must be earned, not claimed, that royal power serves best when it serves humbly, that the crown is not a prize to be grasped but a burden to be borne, not for the glory of the king but for the welfare of the kingdom. The chronicle closes not with an ending but with a beginning, the first chapter in a long struggle to balance authority with accountability, power with restraint, the need for government with the requirements of justice. It will be a struggle that spans centuries, marked by advances and retreats, victories and defeats, the slow, painful evolution of political wisdom. But it begins here, in this moment when a kingdom learns that even kings must answer to something higher than their own will, that power corrupts those who exercise it without limit, and that the true glory of authority lies not in its assertion but in its restraint, not in the fear it inspires but in the love it earns, not in the obedience it commands but in the service it provides to those who must live under its shadow. The bell of St. Paul's tolls again as midnight approaches, marking not just the end of another day but the end of an era. The age of absolute monarchy in England draws toward its close, and with it ends also the medieval dream of earthly authority that mirrors heavenly power, of kings who rule as gods rule, without question, without limit, without accountability to any but themselves. What rises in its place will be imperfect, incomplete, subject to all the failures and corruptions that plague human institutions. But it will be built upon a recognition that power serves purpose beyond itself, that authority exists for those it governs, and that the true test of government lies not in its strength to compel but in its wisdom to persuade, not in its ability to punish but in its capacity to serve. The chronicle of royal justice ends where all such chronicles must end, not with answers but with questions, not with certainties but with hopes, not with the promise of perfection but with the commitment to struggle towards something better than what has come before. It is enough. In the end, it is more than enough. It is everything.